I live and work in the rural Midwest outdoors. There are things that live out here with me. Original research and report by Uger, with additional research and edits by The Facts and Fiction. Night drive footage generously provided by Jade Widow Drives. Hey, glad you could make it. Buckle up and let's get going. I've got some more cool I want to show you. Alright, let's do this. And good to see you again. So, you know that I've been doing a lot of research on the paranormal and cryptids from our last few drives. I already told you about the vampire slayer in Romania and the yeti that ate that park ranger in Sweden. And the last week was the giant spiders in the Congo that, well, supposedly ate that kid back in the 1970s. I was thinking about covering the topic of either billy apes, it's kind of like a Bigfoot, but smaller. Basically walking chimps with stone tools, and they're called lion killers, and they apparently like big game hunting, which in their eyes includes humans. I also was thinking about maybe the Aswang. It's sort of like a vampiric skinwalker deal from the Philippines. Maybe I'll tell you about those in another drive. Just message me if you're interested in that. But this time, I actually found something way closer to home, and it's actually an ongoing series of events. Today, I want to tell you about my friend Roger, and the things he's been experiencing starting about a year ago. Apparently, he's being stalked by crawlers, feral people, fleshgate, wendigos, not sure what you want to call it, maybe even doppelgänger. We've been talking back and forth, and he's been gathering a bunch of information from the other locals in his area, and I've been taking these stories and sort of compiling them chronologically and sending them back his way for accuracy checks. Anyway, to make this easy, I'm just going to tell it all from his perspective. Now let me tell you the story of the Boone County Crawler. Hey, my name is Roger. I'll start this off by saying I grew up completely, 100% adamant that the paranormal isn't real. It can all be rationalized, and that people who believed in it haven't thought about it hard enough. I've made other posts about paranormal events that have happened in my life recently that have completely changed my mind. I live on a small, rural lot between a cornfield and a small forest in a camper. My town's name is Boone, and I've lived in Boone County my entire life, and I know the entire county like the back of my hand. It's super rural, only about 25,000 people or so in the entire county. To put that into perspective, that's the same amount of people that live in just a few blocks in Manhattan, spread out over my entire county. The countryside is really hilly, lots of rivers, forests, and hundreds of old mines absolutely everywhere. This being said, I've come to the conclusion that my experiences around the rural and wooded parts of this country are with crawlers. I'm 100% sure of it. Well, at least what I've seen. I'm not necessarily sure of the name, but crawler seems fitting. And I've actually had many encounters with them. None back to back, but they happen pretty frequently. There's a forested park in the middle of town that I've hated going to since I was little, especially at night. As I got older, my cousin and I thought getting scared was really fun, so we'd go there at night on purpose, but never lasted long, and I always felt like I was being watched. This, on top of urban legends of people going missing there at night, have always made me feel pretty uneasy. So fast forward to a few years ago. I got married, and I'm settling into life as a husband. I'd take my large, all-black German Shepherd, Fenrir, on walks with me at night, and I always like walking towards the park, but I usually don't actually enter it. The first time something weird happened, was on just such a walk about 5 years ago. I was walking Fenrir, and the woods were to the front and to the right of me. To the left and behind me was the edge of the neighborhood and a small playground, when the normal nighttime wildlife noises went completely silent. My dog also started acting super anxious. You should know he's usually a very stoic and quiet dog, 120 pounds and built like a tank. He's an all-black German Shepherd, and he looks very intimidating, and he knows it. I'm also a certified dog trainer and have raised him since birth, so he's very well behaved. I then heard rustling in the woods following me, and I felt like I was being stalked. Nothing new per se for this stretch of woods, but it was enough to unnerve me. I ran home, and while that on its own isn't enough to say crawler or wendigo or whatever, it is the start of these encounters. I had a few similar encounters in the years following, but last year, things really amped up. I was out on a late walk again around midnight with Fenrir, my wife Kelsey, and our new little dog named Booger. He's a Terrier Chihuahua mix. We're walking down the same path of my initial encounter several years prior, and about 3 blocks away from the woods when 4 or so deer come bolting out of the trees and into the street directly towards us. They seemed to be terrified and didn't pay us any mind as they continued running. Then I hear what I can only describe as a human trying to mimic the sounds of a monkey. I honestly thought it was a little silly at the time. Some bozo in the woods scaring deer with monkey noises. That is to say, until later on when I was with a friend who knew nothing about that story. Well, we had a similar experience under very distressing circumstances. We'll come back to that. At the time, however, we simply laughed the event off as some kids playing around. We continue the remaining few blocks towards the wood line the deer had run out of, and turn, and we're walking parallel to the woods when we both spot 2 reflective eyes and a clearly outlined silhouette staring at us from the tree line. We then heard a deep growl followed by a low-pitched, almost hissing sound. Both our dogs acknowledged this as well, Finn staring forward and Booger growling softly, and we decided it was time to head home. I made a Facebook post in our community group, and a lot of other people told similar stories around the town. Around this time, I got a job as a tour guide and maintenance worker for Rail Explorers, where I still work today. Basically, we take unused or tour-specific railroad sections that aren't used federally, and we have these cool motor-assisted pedal carts that allow you to explore the tracks. It's honestly super cool and fun. The one I work at, specifically, is just a few minutes from where I live, and it runs through the woods in a section of the county that's otherwise inaccessible by vehicle and very difficult to access by foot. The track takes you under an old car bridge before raising up 150 feet off the ground and crossing a section of forest that is literally so rocky and uneven, it was easier for the original builders to just build a giant bridge over it than to try and level out the terrain itself. You then are taken over a second, smaller bridge that is still hundreds of feet long, and cross a river before you arrive at the main section of forest our track explores. A typical tour will consist of 4 employees on a lead bike. I'm honestly not sure why we call them bikes when we have 4 wheels, but I guess that doesn't matter. The tour will have 4 employees on the lead bike, 2 on the rear bike, and the tourist bikes will be sandwiched in the middle, each carrying up to 4 occupants. The lead bike will drop an employee off to supervise intersections or bridges and make sure tour bikes stay on the correct route, are given safety instructions for crossing the bridges, only cross one at a time, etc. Staff bikes are also much faster than tour bikes, and we're outfitted with radios, battery-powered floodlights, and reflective safety vests to make sure we can direct tour bikes through the route safely. The reason I'm explaining all this is to highlight that while you could technically get to our tour area by foot, it would only really be accessible if you were to float down the river from town and then hike up a pretty formidable series of steep, loose dirt hills, and then reach the forest above, and then hike, and all this to say, it's a large section of forest that's very hard to access on foot, and it even takes an orchestrated, well-coordinated effort to access by rail. So with that context out of the way, let's talk a bit about what happened. I was about 6 months into the job. Our season normally starts around April 1st, and it's well into the fall. We often work until midnight, as our final tour reservation leaves around 9 p.m. So for the last 2 months of our tour season, the final route is done in complete darkness. On one particular night, we were running a bit behind, so instead of leaving the depot at sunset, we were leaving at dusk. I was stationed at the larger bridge which runs above the forest, and by the time we reached it, it was pitch black, aside from a little bit of light the stars provided. My coworkers dropped me off and waited with me until the first tour bike arrived. They then continued ahead to the next bridge while I chatted with the tour bike and gave them our little safety speech. I was trying to buy some time for my coworkers to get staged at the next checkpoint and make sure there wasn't an enormous gap between this bike and the one that should be coming up the track. Normally, bikes come through pretty much one after another, and so the fact that I couldn't see the next one was already a bit odd. Assuming the next bike, however, would be coming around the corner any minute, and that I'd compensated enough for our pacing window, I let the first bike continue on the track. And, just like that, I was alone. It wasn't long before my feet began to throb a bit, so I fidgeted in place and I tried to shake them loose to keep them warm, all the while craning my neck to see if I could glance the next set of approaching headlights coming around the corner. When my fidgeting didn't help either my feet or my growing sense of unease, I pulled up my radio to check in with the rear bike, only to realize the radio traffic had been oddly quiet. Pressing the talk button, the radio hissed out a pure burst of static. For those who aren't familiar with radios, this is particularly odd because if somebody else had their button depressed, I should be able to hear it without pressing mine, but that isn't what happened. My radio only produced this static when I was pressing the talk button, which I honestly have never really seen before. Feeling a bit more frantic, I turned it off, turned it back on again, switched the channels, checked the battery. Each time there was nothing but static on the radio, which had been perfectly working throughout the shift. Standing on the rail and up on my tiptoes, I tried again to make out any sign of headlights or the sound of a motor coming around the corner, but nothing. Until I heard the first snap coming from the forest. The snap was loud and followed by a long silence. My eyes still fixed on the part of the woodline I thought I'd heard the sound from, I then hear another on my side of the tracks. The second my head turned to the new source of noise, there was a quick flurry of footsteps from where I had been looking at first, almost as if something had been waiting for me to look away before it moved. Well and truly nervous, I stepped off the rail and backed up to the big floodlight I had shining above my head. It was backlighting me, so anything in the woods could see me perfectly illuminated, and yet I couldn't see shit. Which was a problem. I stepped behind the floodlight and began panning it across the woodline to see if I could make anything out. Unfortunately, it really just illuminated the first row or two of trees and cast even thicker shadows behind them. Weighing my options, I pulled out my personal flashlight, lit it, and then flipped the switch on the floodlight. The moment I did, I knew I'd made a mistake. I heard the same flurry of footsteps coming from the forest, but this time beelining it straight for me. Scrambling back for my switch, I hit it just in time to see something pale and lanky dart back into the tree line. I'm at the point of a full-blown panic attack at this point, truly unsure of what to do and how long whatever this thing or these things in the wood would be deterred by this floodlight. I was also keenly aware that the light was unidirectional, and if one of them figured out a way to circle behind me and maybe up the cliffside to where my back was. And then it happened. I finally saw headlights rounding the corner and the soft buzz of a motor. I heard the footsteps essentially scurry off deeper into the woods and away from the tracks in response. I let out this huge sigh of relief as they rounded the corner. As they did, my radio chirped to life. I had been alone for 20 minutes in complete radio silence, with nothing but a floodlight between me and something in the woods, and the moment these headlights broke the corner, my radio started working. I shook myself a little bit, getting prepared to greet the next bike, and I noticed they had a little boy with them. Talking with them for a bit, it turned out he was scared of the dark. Yeah, buddy. Me too. I'm terrified at this point, but have to act appropriate. Even more so because this boy, and apparently they had been delayed trying to comfort the boy, hence the 20-minute gap between the cars. I try and crack a few jokes to lighten the mood, though I can't seem to get the thought of something watching me from the darkness out of my mind. Then, as I'm finishing my speech, I hear the sound of leaves and rocks tumbling from the cliffside behind me, like something had slipped on the rocks climbing up. Jesus fucking Christ, I jumped so high I swear I could have cleared the bike, and I spin around with my flashlight on instinct. Poor kid. The only thing louder than my scream was probably his. I apologized profusely to the parents and told them it was probably just a deer and they were good to go across the bridge. At this point, the traffic flow had returned to normal, so I didn't have to worry about bikes being spaced out like they were before, which is very, very rare, I'll add. But you'd better believe I was ready to stall for as long as possible to make sure there were no further gaps if I needed to. Fortunately, I didn't. The bikes came through like normal, with the employee bike bringing up the rear. I hopped in, still shaken, and honestly was just glad to be in a bike with my coworkers and on our way out for the evening. I don't remember much of the ride back, but I was pretty quiet, just thinking about what had happened, really. We picked up our remaining coworkers from their stations, closed things up for the night, and went home. I crashed instantly and woke up the next day feeling pretty tired, despite how long I'd slept. I guess I don't really need to say I didn't sleep well despite technically being unconscious. All night long and into the day, I couldn't stop thinking about that extreme encounter the day before. Finally, sometime in the afternoon, I can sense my body is exhausted enough to actually let me sleep, so I decide to take a nap. Well, that nap lasted way too long, and I didn't wake up until around 1 a.m, but at least I felt rested. A bit annoyed with myself for accidentally sleeping so long, I put my shoes on to take Booger, our small dog, out for a walk. We were walking down in the direction of that park, the same one I always felt nervous in as a kid, and where my wife and I heard those kids scare that deer. But I wasn't going to go all the way, just down a few blocks towards it and then turn around well before the park. When I go for a walk, I always call my wife on my Bluetooth earbuds so my hands are free, and this time was no different. Booger and I are about a block away from the old elementary school and playground when I felt like I was being watched. I turn around to look and see a man dressed in all black, walking parallel to me but on the opposite sidewalk to mine. I don't know where he came from, as there were no cars around and I had just walked through a very bright intersection a few seconds prior and didn't see him at all. I keep an eye on him as he closes the distance between us, but since he's on the other side of the street, I'm not too worried. He gets to the point where he's a few feet behind me, but still on the other side of the road, and then does the strangest thing. First, he speeds up very fast to walk perfectly parallel to me. Then, he matches my pace for about a block. At this point, I'm walking way too fast, trying to keep away from him, and breathing far too hard to continue talking with my wife, but I did tell her what was going on. This guy then crosses the street even faster, almost running, but still walking. Power walking. Diagonally straight at me. I honestly don't even know how to react, so I speed up even more, and before I even really know what's happening, the dude passed right by me, so close that our jackets brushed up against each other. I turned my head and looked at him, and he didn't turn his back, but while I'm searching for his face, I try to make eye contact and figure out what this guy's intentions are. Bit late, I know. I realized there wasn't anything tangible there at all. There were simply no features on him. It just looked like skin stretched across the front where his face would be. Honestly, it was like he was wearing a morph suit made of skin. Completely in shock for a minute, I stop walking and he continues on ahead of me at the same angle. I start to take in his body shape and clothes, and I then realize he looks like me, but without a face. We were wearing similar clothing, he was my same size and height, and we had the same haircut and color. It was honestly like if an AI made a replica of me, but only vague bumps and impressions pressed up under the skin where my facial features should be. He continued on this exact same trajectory, his head completely fixated in front of him, which takes him cutting diagonally across the front yard of a triplex building. He keeps walking on this angle and then straight up to the front door of that triplex before pressing his forehead on the front door and freezing. At that point, I'm done, and started stuttering to my wife again. I tightened my grip around Booger's leash and practically walked backwards with my eyes fixed on this guy, and he didn't move once. Then, when I'm about 3 blocks away, Booger stumbles for a second, and my eyes flick down instinctively to make sure he's okay or I don't trip on him. And when I snap my eyes back up, he's gone. No sounds of running, no blurred movement, no sight or sound of the door closing. He's just completely gone in maybe half a second of me looking away. If I wasn't done before, I am absolutely finished now, so I pick up Booger and I book it home. The fact that this all happened the day after my first major encounter and right in the middle of the peak of these experiences, despite it being completely unlike everything else I've experienced, I can't help think it's connected somehow. So let's jump forward a week or two and tie all this back to where we started. I'm riding in the front cart, this time with my friend who I'll call Tony. Tony is Native American and very in tune with his culture. I really enjoy hearing his stories, and he enjoys sharing them, so it works out. Anyway, Tony and I were headed back to the depot on the front car. We were a good ways ahead of the tour group, and since the employee bikes are so much faster than the tour ones, we stopped the cart in the middle of the forest bridge. This sounds pretty scary, given the bridge has massive gaps between the wooden support beams that you could easily fall through. And I'm even a bit afraid of heights myself, but you get used to it, and honestly it's beautiful up there. It also means that you're not just sitting there surrounded by woods on both sides, which is honestly a lot more scary of a prospect for me now. The forest bridge itself has a fantastic view on both sides, and if you're not an employee, you don't really get to just sit there and enjoy it. So we parked the bike, and are watching the stars and having small talk. We're 100 or so feet in the air and above the woods. The night is perfectly clear, and we can hear dogs barking from some of the farms across the river, over 2 miles away. Then it goes silent. No dogs from across the river, no insects or birds or nightlife scurrying around. It's like everything just froze in place in anticipation of something. Then the silence is broken by the long, drawn-out, and then quick and sharper whoops of a human mimicking a monkey noise. The exact same noise I'd heard years ago walking with Fenrir and my wife. But this time, it wasn't by a park or near a residential neighborhood. There wasn't an easy explanation of bored teens spooking deer on the edge of town. We were miles from the nearest house by air and hours upon hours of travel by foot from the nearest building, let alone a house with teenagers who might otherwise explain this. Tony and I shared a look, and before I could even really process what was happening, the monkey whoops were replaced by a deep, guttural growling, followed by a dull hiss. Also, the same series of sounds, in the same order, that I had heard all those years prior. Tony looks at me, completely serious, and tells me in a stern tone that we need to get out of here right now. I don't need any further convincing, so I put the bike in gear and gun it out of there. As we get closer to the depot, I start to calm down and say something about how it's the same spot as last time. Tony looks at me, very concerned, and asks what I meant, the same spot as last time. So I told him what had happened to me when I was stationed at the forest bridge a few weeks before. His eyes went wide as I told him about the radio going out and the gap in the cars and the noises and quick glimpses of something pale moving around me in the forest. And when I finished, he told me what had happened to him that night. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had an incident. We knew it was the same night because radios acting up like that and the extended gap between carts, as I mentioned, is particularly rare. We take good care of our equipment, do frequent radio checks, and they were working the entire night, both before and after. So the radio failure, in conjunction with such a weird gap between cars, was something that we all remembered. On that night, Tony was stationed at an intersection near the end of the route that's not in the forest, but a part of farmland by the river. There's a road that crosses the section of track, and even though it's extremely rural, none of us have ever even really seen a car there that I can remember, and there's literally cornfields as far as you can see on all sides. We still need someone to stand there just in case and stop cars or otherwise make sure bikes get through safely. So Tony is waiting in his assigned location when he too notices there's an odd gap in traffic, and he too pulls out his radio to try and see what's going on. And when he presses his talk button, he also gets nothing but a burst of static. He then starts hearing rustling in the cornfield, similar to how I did, like footsteps flanking him and getting closer, all while trying to remain unseen. But whatever was out there with him was also whispering his name and trying to get him to come out into the cornfield. Fortunately, there's a big enough gap between the side of the road and the cornfields that he was able to see a lot further than I could, and the movement never left the cornfields or entered the light of his flood lamp. By the time he told me all of this, the other bikes caught up to us at the depot, and so we closed up shop and went home for the night, never really finishing our conversation. Tony moved states to Nevada shortly after this for a job, so I also never got to follow up with him on it. Though we're still friends, so I'll probably reach out to him and ask about it. But the more I've sat with it, the thing that really gets me about this isn't actually his name being called, or me seeing movement, or potentially hearing it trying to sneak up on the cliffs behind me. It's that all of these things occurred during the same 20-minute window where the radios went down and the bike traffic was stopped, leaving anyone assigned to a station completely isolated. And to add to it, my radio was working right up until the lead bike left my station, and Tony was on that lead bike on his way to get dropped off at the intersection. My radio blackout started when he left and was almost over by the time he would have been dropped off, and his would have started. Both of our blackouts were timed perfectly to coincide with the gap between bikes, just when we were alone. So my question in all of this is, what caused that little boy to be so scared that his parents needed to stop their bike and comfort him in the first place? What then caused my radio to go out as soon as the lead bike left my station? Why did it start again as soon as the next bike arrived? And why did Tony's radio continue working perfectly until he was dropped off and the lead bike passed him? Finally, why, for the hell of it, can I not stop thinking that maybe that lead bike was used as some sort of signal to trigger our blackout, leaving Tony and I each alone, without contact, and vulnerable. This is getting quite long at this point, so I'm going to jump ahead a few months to the middle of November 2023. Lots of smaller things happened in between, but none are as intense or bizarre as what I've just described. It's about a week before Thanksgiving, and despite how much it unnerves me walking through it, I like to drive through that park in town when I just want to go for a drive. I generally have a very hard time sleeping, so being up late or at otherwise odd hours is pretty normal for me, if you didn't guess as much from my other stories. This night, it's about 2 in the morning. I'm wide awake, and I decided I'd go for one of these drives. Fenrir was also up, so I opened the passenger seat for him, let him hop in, and popped in a Melvin CD before pulling out of my driveway and driving leisurely towards the park. There wasn't any traffic, obviously, which is part of why I like these late drives, and I was just driving and thinking about whatever crossed my mind. But as soon as I get past the entrance gates, that all changes. Now, despite having just told multiple stories where I was scared shitless, in general, I'm not easily frightened. But pulling through those gates, I felt very uneasy and weird. To be clear, when I say that I like driving through this park at night, it's not because it's necessarily peaceful. Going to that park in the day is unsettling, and at night, it honestly fills me with this primal fear, way beyond fight or flight. I've never felt that way in my life anywhere else, ever. And I feel it every time I'm there, which I guess is part of what fascinates me so much. It's so intense and so consistent, and somehow being in the car makes it feel just safe enough to check out. Honestly, and maybe others who have experienced depression or other mental health issues can relate, but the intense, morbid curiosity and fear almost feels calming in a way. This time, however, there was something extra about it that really felt off. As I pulled in, I rolled the windows mostly up, just enough so Fenrir could still poke his head out, but not enough to let him leap out. As I go deeper into the woods, that extra level of unease feels worse and worse. It got to the point that I decided to turn around before realizing I was already past the halfway point, so turning around would only make me stay in the woods for longer. But the feeling was worse than it had ever been before, growing up or as an adult, and I actually felt in danger. So I start speeding down the road, only slowing down for turns I couldn't see around. I round the last corner before the final stretch of road that would lead me out of the park, and what I saw made me have nightmares for months. There, directly in front of my car, was this pale, skinny humanoid fucking crawling on its hands and feet. It was tall and lanky and not quite human, and it was crawling like a fucking ape on all fours, tearing out of the tree line on my right at an easy 20 miles an hour and darting straight into the tree line on my left. I slammed on the brakes on nothing but instinct, and this thing is barely halfway across the road when Fenrir went absolutely ballistic like I've never seen him before. When I say ballistic, he doesn't bark at people, he doesn't bark at animals, he doesn't so much as woof when he sees another dog, and he went from sitting happily in the passenger seat to literally trying to force himself out of the small gap in the window, all while foaming at the mouth and snarling like he had gone fully rabid out of nowhere. He never, ever acts like that. To hell with blind corners, I tear out of there while Fenrir continues his rampage, jumping into the back seat and still trying to get out of the back window at this thing. By the time I'm home, I'm a complete and utter mess. Fenrir is still on edge, constantly looking out the windows and growling at doors, more things he never does. And I've personally raised and trained him from birth. I want to emphasize that we don't have bears here. The only animal of that size are large humans, deer, and maybe an extremely rare mountain lion, though that's debatable. But while it was roughly the same size, the proportions were all off. That wasn't a bear. That wasn't a deer. It definitely wasn't a mountain lion. And it sure as hell wasn't human. After all of this, I was just left thinking. I'd finally seen it. I got the answer I thought I wanted to the monkey noises, the things circling me at the bridge, and whatever it was trying to get Tony to come out into those cornfields. It all makes too much sense, but in an awful nonsense sort of way. Sure, weird stuff happens, but it's all so easy to rationalize after the fact. Maybe it was just a coincidence with the radios dying. It was just raccoons or a bald deer circling me in the woods. Tony was just trying to get a jump out of me. I guess we're just really good at gaslighting ourselves like that, and I never really fully expected I'd have an answer to my morbid curiosity. But my God, now that I've seen it, ignorance was bliss.